Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the continuing story of Pensacola, and that of course is North America's first place city. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Pensacola's waterfront. And that is a story, of course, that ties in with not only Pensacola's history, but world history. Because as we turn back the pages of ancient history, all the way back to the Sumerians and the Egyptians and the Phoenicians, the presence of a waterfront that was usable for navigation, for trade, was essential. And consequently, when explorers came to the western world and began to look at Florida, the fact that Pensacola had this, or this area had this wonderful bay, this wonderful harbor, made it a target for the selection of a site for the first colonies. And this was basically our story up through the end of the 17th century. And this was when, of course, in 1699, Pensacola's second settlement began. For the next 20 years, when the Spanish were located here and the French were about 60 miles to the west, Pensacola slowly began its story of as a place where trade could take place. Now, basically, the trade here was only to sustain the men and women who were here. There was no trade back and forth, except, of course, for assistance back and forth with the French at Mobile or Biloxi. But for the next 20 years, that was pretty much it, as was the case when the Spanish created still another settlement a little bit to the west on Santa Rosa Island. That, of course, began in 1722, lasted there for 30 years, and the purpose of that little settlement really fortifies what we're talking about here today, because that settlement was placed there not really for trade, but to have a Spanish settlement there to assist ships of going back and forth, whether they were naval or commercial, that might need a little help, a little bit of supply, a little assistance. That village was there as a kind of a stopgap for that. Now, when the Spanish moved across the bay in 1752, they began a new village. We have very little story to tell about that because, frankly, we don't know. But then, of course, came the British, and they arrived here in 1763, and for a time, the first governor, George Johnstone, began to try and use a mercantile type arrangement that would literally circumvent the trade laws that were in effect for the British Empire at that time. George Johnstone and some of his friends were literally trading with the Spanish to the west and to some in the Caribbean islands. And he did this until a British naval officer arrived who was a sort of a spit and polish person, slapped George's wrist and said, "You can't do that anymore." And so basically for the balance of the British period, which of course ended in 1781, the British story on the waterfront was one of defense. They brought in a number of smaller warships that were here to defend the colony. And of course, when the Great Siege and Battle took place here in 1781, there was a battle along the waterfront with the British finally burning their own vessels, the Spanish moving in a large flotilla to carry the soldiers that were participated in the siege. And that basically was the story of that period. Now, one other element, of course, needs to be remembered about the British story. It wasn't one of a lot of trade with other colonies or other settlements, but it began in the year 1764-65 when the British governor brought here an Indian trader, a man named John Stuart. And Stuart was an experienced man in dealing with the Indians, and his goal was to bring manufactured British trade goods to Pensacola and then trade them to Indian tribes, the Creeks, the Cherokees, and others, who would bring in furs and skins to Pensacola, and they'd have a big harvest here every October or thereabouts. And literally a whole area was cleared along the waterfront, what today we would say west of DeViller Street, perhaps as far as A or B along that way. It was cleared, and this was where the Indians would settle in as their campsite. They would bring their furs and skins, trade them for the trade goods, and then, of course, ultimately British vessels would pick these furs up and carry them back to Britain as part of their ongoing trade. Now, that same arrangement continued when the Spanish took over here again in 1781. This time, of course, the effort was made at first to trade Spanish manufactured goods for the same furs and skins. That didn't work because the Indians did not like the Spanish products. So in turn, the Spanish government brought here two men who became quite famous in our history, William Panton and John Leslie. And they began what we, of course, remember as the Panton-Leslie Trading Post right down on the waterfront. And they utilized the same cleared area to the west as the Indian encampment every fall. And that Indian trade, which, of course, had had begun back in British times when the 1760 would continue on, although of course it was tapering off after a while. There was a vestige of it still here into the 1820s. That's basically what we look at, of course, in the early Spanish period, and the final Spanish period, because that's by and large all there was. Up to the year 1821, Spain was, this colony was very small. All it was doing in terms of other trade had very little to do with the waterfront, although perhaps a little bit should be said about it. The Spanish did have a way of bringing in certain products for which they had an excess. And that excess then was traded to the new settlers that were coming into what we today call Alabama, and who had begun the little villages to the north of us, villages called Mason and Brooklyn and Bellevue. These little villages were farm communities. They had excess products, and they literally brought those products down a newly created army road to Pensacola and traded them for things that the Spanish had, basically coffee and certain grain items that the Americans could not raise themselves. So that basically was our trade until the Americans arrived. The waterfront was not a very busy place. The British had erected a dock basically where Palafox Street is today. It was that single dock that was used for military vessels and for what trade there was. And so there's where things stood when the United States acquired Florida in 1821. And things probably wouldn't have changed radically then in that period either, except that there was a great concern in Washington about what the French and the British might do in Latin America if and when the Spanish governmental units there through Central and South America began to collapse, as they did in revolutions of that time. And so to protect our American interests, the Monroe administration published what we of course remember as the Monroe Doctrine, and to back that up, they began to establish, number one, a South Atlantic naval fleet, and to serve that fleet, they created here a Navy Yard. We've discussed that in other times and other episodes. And of course, this begins with the survey here to decide that Pensacola was to be the place. And then just shortly thereafter, there in the mid-1820s, Commodore Lewis Warrington arrived, began putting the Navy Yard together. And it, of course, was where the naval aviation operations are today. To accompany the Navy Yard, we had to have, of course, a series of protective forts. And for that, Captain William Chase arrived. He was the engineer using plans that had been developed by the Coast Artillery. Now, this is where the first major change begins that we can see along the waterfront, because Captain Chase, had to have supplies. And to gain the needed brick and lumber and timbers that he needed for his forts, he worked with local people who had money to literally establish mills up the Escambia River. They had located proper deposits of clay, and consequently they began to make brick. There were probably 7 of these brickyards up the river, and also other mills began to cut timber and produce it into lumber. And then to bring that material to the sites of the forts, Chase negotiated and had built small barges. These were not big vessels, but sufficient to carry the brick and the lumber. And now to carry those barges, the community began to receive, and Chase arranged for this, of course, the first of what we saw steam-fired vessels here. These were small tugboats that were of sufficient size to bring these barges down the river, then across the bay to wherever Chase needed them, first of all in Fort Pickens, and then Barrancas and the others. And these were the first steam vessels we saw. And of course, that traffic would continue coming down the river across the bay. That would continue on our waterfront up until the late 1840s. It's interesting that we also have a record. Now, I have a very interesting book here. This is called the Florida Territorial Papers. These are the papers that were produced from territorial government, of course, early on in Tallahassee. They are some of the letters and correspondence date with the correspondence back and forth to Washington. But this tells us all kinds of things that were happening here, what people wanted in Pensacola and Apalachicola and St. Joseph. But one of the first things that we note from this is that late in the 1820s, 1827 exactly, a steamship they called the Fanny arrived in Pensacola. This of course was just created all sorts of excitement, because when the Fanny arrived, it was the first large steam-fired vessel we saw. She landed and docked on the Palafox Street Pier and was examined by all the people. She did not stay here. The Fanny was on her way to the Apalachicola River system, where she would work as a transport for cotton for many years. But nonetheless, steam was coming to Pensacola, and we could see it gradually beginning its effect along the waterfront here. Now, at that point, between 1828 to 30, Pensacola's people wanted other things. One of the things that appears in this book, of course, is a petition signed by more than 60 local businessmen to the federal government asking subsidy support for a mail packet, a steam-fired mail packet, which would run twice a week between Mobile and Pensacola. And ultimately they got it. And so the waterfront again was changing just a little bit that way as well. Now, in this period, and this carries us on up to the war between the states, Pensacola's waterfront did not change a great deal. The action along the Gulf was about 100 miles to the east of us, where Apalachicola and St. Joseph were becoming major cotton export centers. Pensacola did not get into that trade at that time because our agricultural land was still covered with huge pine trees, and B, when they finally got some of the trees cut down, they recognized that our soil constituents here just were not favorable for cotton or tobacco. That would be the case again until we had a fertilizer manufacturing plant here late in the 1880s, and when they had that, of course, available to us, then the statistics on cotton exports for Pensacola would change as well. But when we came to the war between the states, this was a period in which Pensacola's waterfront got a lot of attention, because by this time, first of all, a railroad was finally under construction between Pensacola and what we then called Pollard Junction, up just over the Alabama line. Secondly, we had the Navy Yard. Third, we had these wonderful forts. Fourth, we had this great harbor here. And so people reasoned that if Florida should secede from the Union, if a new country should be created, this would make a wonderful port of entry for all kinds of commerce, because people reckoned that if war should come, the Federal Navy would be able to blockade the ports along the Atlantic, and Pensacola just might be the perfect place, the port of entry for all the goods, or many of the goods, that the New South would need. Well, of course, all of that came to a head when Florida did secede. Colonel Chase, now he's a colonel who had been a captain before, Colonel Chase led the militia that did capture the Navy Yard, did capture Fort Barrancas, Fort McRae, but they did not capture Fort Pickens. So all of the dreams that people had of Pensacola becoming a huge port for the South just evaporated. Pensacola was here almost in a state of siege now for the next 13 months, and nothing much happened except a minor battle or two along the waterfront. But we did not become and did not have the resources at that point to be a major seaport. People used the bay, of course, for local commercial fishing. People used it for recreation. It was a beautiful site. People had their own small boats. But basically, if we look at the picture in the year 1860, 61, 62, basically we still had the Palafox Street Wharf. We had the Navy Yard available out there to do manufacturing, production, making of vessels and maintaining them. Their record of activity was very small in this first 40 years that they had been here. So basically, as we came to the end of the period that we would call the Civil War period, our waterfront was there. It was still just as beautiful as it had been seen by the first explorers many years before, but we had not made much use of it. And so basically people were saying, well, what will ever happen to Pensacola? It has so much potential, but it's sort of the tail on the dog as far as Florida development is concerned. And that's the way things were until developments changed history, and this of course began not here but in Germany and France and England, beginning about the year 1868 and 69, when people there realized that the Industrial Revolution had built cities which had turned into slums, and all of this had to be readdressed, and that required building materials, and Pensacola was here with them.